Grant Dusting is the Director of Strategy at McCrindle, one of Australia's leading social research and advisory firms. He works with boards, executives and policymakers to translate trends and data into clear strategic direction. Grant combines big picture trend analysis with practical application, helping organisations turn research into action and complexity into clarity. Today he'll challenge us to think forward, not just where we are, but where we're heading and how we can lead with confidence. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Grant Dusting.
Thank you, Peter. Wow, that's very loud. Good morning, everyone. I thought I'd use the handheld just to get a bit more freedom to move around and try to make things a bit more engaging for everyone. Welcome those who are coming back from morning tea. The morning tea must have been really good and the conversation's even better, so I'm sure people keep trickling in, but I've got some time with you this morning which has been allocated, so I want to honour your time for being here ready to go, and so we can get underway. So, thank you team at the back. So as was mentioned by Peter, my name is Grant Dusting. I'm the Director of Strategy at McCrindle, and my goal this morning is to provoke you by sharing some of the trends that are changing in the world around us that will be relevant for you and your peers in the beef industry over the coming years. And my hope is that this session sparks conversations, sparks ideas on, okay, so what are some of these challenges that we're going to be facing and what are some of the opportunities that will be presented by these trends? And my hope is that over lunch and post this conference, that actually what I share today will help spark some of those conversations. So rather than being a full stop to the matter, it's more of a starting point to think about, okay, things are changing, times are changing. What does that mean for us in our particular business, industry, association and context, depending on where you fit? Pete used the term social research to describe McCrindle, our company, and that's what we are, social researchers. What does that mean? Because usually when I'm introduced that way, I get the kind of blank looks that I'm getting a bit now, which is very understandable. In essence, it means that we study how people in society are changing. And it's as simple and as complex as that because people are very complex. It's a broad brief and it's why most people don't really know what to call us, so we get a few names like these, but they all boil down to the same thing. It's studying people, studying societies, how are we changing and what does that mean for leaders like yourselves. Now we do work with a lot of data, so we are unashamedly data nerds. We love a good Excel spreadsheet. Maybe some of you in the room share that affinity. I'm assuming many don't, and that's okay. That's why I'm here, to try to take it from data points and ones and zeros to something that you can engage with today. I was speaking to a mate a little while ago and said, Grant, you guys are basically professional people watchers. You guys are like the people on Gogglebox. That's just what they do. They just watch people and observe people in their natural habitat, so to speak. So I wasn't expecting that characterization, but it's probably not the worst one, because really what we do does boil down to trying to understand people and helping leaders like yourselves know what do people want, how is that changing over time, and what does that mean for us. We've produced a lot of resources, reports, books, articles, podcasts, so if you're into that and you love learning and more information, through my presentation, I'll put up a couple of links to some of our latest free resources that you can access if that's your cup of tea. But for everyone else, what I share this morning will get you on your way. And for anyone who's interested, I will make the slides available to the team. Happy for them to be shared around later if that's of interest. So before we think about the future, because the future is really hard to think about, which is why a lot of people struggle to do it, I thought before we jump to that, particularly after coming back from morning tea, let's think about some of the changes we've seen just in the last decade, in the recent past, and what that can teach us about how the world is changing already. One of the ways that we like to do that as social researchers is to use the words of the year. The words of the year are chosen by various dictionaries across the world to try to capture, well, what were some of the key words and concepts that were framing our year? What were people talking about? What was dominating the media, public discussion? What was impacting people? So I thought that might be a good way to kind of get us in the zone of thinking about change and trends in the future, is to think about the last decade through the prism of the words of the year. So let's cast our minds back all the way to 2015. I know it feels a long time ago. It's only 10 years. Word of the year was, for the first time ever, was an emoji. Specifically, the laughter with tears of joy emoji. So straight away, off the bat, you can see that, okay, our world's changing. The way we use language is changing. It's now acceptable that a word of the year could be an emoji, according to the Oxford English Dictionary. And just make sure you don't send this one to someone if they've told you some sad news, because that's the wrong one, as some of you might have found out the hard way. 2016, things took a bit of a darker turn. The word of the year was post-truth. Now, I've got a definition up there. It might be a little hard to read, but essentially it's capturing this concept that appeals to emotion are more likely to get cut through than appealing to facts or evidence. Now, as people who work in data and truth, we don't want to hear this. This is bad news, but this kind of reflects the world we live in, where appeals to emotion are more likely to get influence over people's behaviours than appealing just to the facts, such as the world we live in since 2016. Continuing the theme, 2017, the word of the year was fake news, popularised, of course, by a certain American president, and reminds us that in the last few years, and certainly since 2017, we've been more aware that actually the news and the media and things we read online, you've actually got to question, is this real or is this fake? And it's increasingly hard to do that. And if you're finding that, you're not alone. Actually, everyone's finding this, including leaders in different fields. And so this is just the modern world that we live in, a world of fake news. It doesn't get necessarily brighter. Word of the year in 2018 was toxic. We had a few high-profile royal commissions here in Australia into different institutions and different contexts, and really this word toxic was applied to describe the kind of the environment or the culture of an institution. And so we started hearing this word a lot more applied to workplaces, toxic culture. You might have heard that word. If it's a bad working environment, it would be referred to that. And so that entered our language or gained prominence in 2018, and really you're hearing that word a lot more nowadays. But that was word of the year in 2018. In 2019, the word of the year was climate emergency. Now, in Australia, bushfires, for better or for worse, is part of Australian life, more or less. And so we're fairly acclimatised that that's just part of the natural state of things. But as often happens, when things happen in America, they get the world's attention. And if you remember, in 2019, we had really severe bushfires in California raging. And so got the world's attention, dovetailed in the conversation around climate change and the impacts, and some very vivid examples. And so the word of the year was chosen, climate emergency, because that was really, people were talking about the catastrophic natural disasters and the link with climate change in 2019. 2020, might need to take a deep breath here, because that was a year that many of us want to just scrub from the history. Of course, COVID hit us in 2020. And it threw the good folks at the Oxford English Dictionary, because they departed with their long-standing tradition of just choosing a single word of the year. And they threw up their hands and they said, it's too hard, we can't pick one, there's too much going on, we're going to pick a few. So this was their words of the year in 2020. You can see there, bushfire, impeachment, coronavirus, lockdown, Black Lives Matter, and cancel culture. So that just reminds us that in 2020, not only were we dealing with a global health pandemic, COVID-19, but actually these social movements were springing up, Black Lives Matter, cancel culture, and leaders were not only being expected to know what this is all about, but to have an opinion on it. And that was new, because in the past, if you were running a business, you stick to your business, you sell your products and services. But times were changing and people were expected to have an opinion on this, to make their position known and to express that. So leaders were finding this a big challenge in 2020, and it's continued since, this idea that these social movements, and because of the way the world is so connected now, these things can spring up so quickly. In 2021, the word of the year was vax. just reminding us that that really dominated the discussion, obviously around the COVID vaccines, and really it was everywhere. It was all we were hearing about all year, and I'm very glad that we've moved on from that, and I'm sure you are too. So I'm happy to move on and say thanks 2021. We're happy to be past that. 2022, now I'm not sure if you've heard this term, goblin mode. So let me set the scene. Now those of us, if you live here in the Territory or in other parts of Australia, really, we as a nation were very sheltered through the whole COVID pandemic. And I think sometimes it's easy to forget that. But for most of the world, they were effectively hibernating in their bedrooms for the best part of 2 years. And so many people didn't venture much out of their house. Those who could were working from home, wearing their tracky dacks and their slacks and the casuals, you're doing their Teams calls and Zoom calls. And so as the world started to reopen in 2022, and thereafter people saying, well, hang on, I've been working just fine out of my track pants for 2 years. Why do I have to put on some trousers now just because I'm going to the office? Because, we were getting those back to work office mandates. And so people started saying, well, I don't know, I'm just going to do what suits me. And so the term goblin mode refers to, and I wrote it in my notes here, a type of behavior that is unapologetically lazy and self-indulgent. Your inner goblin, so to speak. So people started challenging, saying, well, why don't we do it this? Why do we have to change just because the world's reopening? We've done things fine for 2 years in a certain way. Why do we have to do it this way? And so that was a conversation, so much so that the word of the year was chosen to be goblin mode, because people were grappling with, well, what does it mean to be professional today? And what standards should we apply? And actually, we work a lot with corporate Australia, and it's undeniable that, I don't see many people wearing track pants to work, admittedly, but it's undeniable to say that the dress code in kind of professional life has definitely changed and got a bit more casual since then. So some things have remained. In 2023, the word of the year was AI. So in late 22, we had ChatGPT kind of burst onto the scene and very quickly gained millions and millions of people who were using it. So you can't really go to a conference these days without hearing people talk about AI and how it's changing things. And yes, it is. And so 2023 word of the year was AI. 24 word of the year was brain rot. Some of you might have heard this term, some might not. So again, some context. You know that feeling when you're kind of scrolling on your phone and you look at the time and then you look back and like an hour and a half's gone by and you go, where did that time go? And you're just mindlessly scrolling on something, could be Facebook or YouTube or whatever. And you go, what was I even looking at? It wasn't even anything meaningful or edifying. That's just so common today for people to feel that. And then when you add in all the AI-generated, technical term, slop for that, when you add that into the mix, particularly for the younger generations, that's kind of what they're being fed now in their online diet. And so this term brain rot captures the sense that actually we're feeling like there's so much content, particularly online, that's really just not edifying, not helpful, but is out there. And 2025, last year, they chose the word rage bait as word of the year. So if you've heard the term clickbait, it's an evolution of that. And again, it's not really a nice word, but it reminds us that this is sadly the context we live in, that actually the big shift in the internet has been, when the internet first started, it was this medium or this place that people could learn and access ideas, and this open library, this public library that everyone could access and really educate themselves and build their knowledge. And increasingly so, sadly, it's being used to just provoke people's anger and emotions, because sadly that's what gets clicks and that's what gets advertising revenue and all the things that follow. So rage bait tries to refer to, well, this is the time we live in where actually so much of what is put out online is deliberately designed to try to get you angry and emotional, because they know that's what's going to get your attention. So that's the last 10 years in words of the year. I'll just take a deep breath after that, I think. And you might feel a bit like this guy on Twitter. He said, don't know about you all, I could really go for some precedented times. Because we've heard that word so much, haven't we? Unprecedented. You hear it so much, you wonder, is anything precedented these days? But potentially you feel like this secondhand bookstore shop owner put up this sign. Please note the post-apocalyptical fiction section has been moved to current affairs. In other words, things that we used to associate with end of the world, global wars and conflicts and doomsday. Oh, that's just the nightly news, folks. That might be a bit how we all feel today. It's a bit exhausting. So That's the last decade. Some of the things that we've been seeing change through the words of the year. So, in talking about trends today and thinking, what can I share that's going to be helpful to you, noting that people are here from different contexts within the industry, I want to use three categories, I suppose, of trends. First, I'm going to share some demographic trends, some demographic changes that are happening, and what does that mean for you. Then we're going to talk about some workforce trends, because many of you are employers or managers and leaders, and you're training and educating and mentoring kind of generations of workers coming through. So there's a few big things changing there that are going to be relevant. And then I'll finish with talking about what are some of the consumer trends that we're seeing, what people value in goods and services and products, and how is that psyche, the consumer psyche, changing, and what does the research show us? So let's launch into some demographic changes. Start with thinking about our national population, because I know that as an industry, you're really exporting all over Australia and beyond. So in our own backyard here, if we look at the last 200 years of change, you can see there that graph. I'm not going to go through it line by line, but it just shows you the scale of how fast we've been growing as a nation. And not only can you see the scale of change, you can also see that that line is not kind of plateauing or declining. It's actually, it's on an upward curve, which says that every year as a nation, we're adding more and more people. We're growing at a larger, growing larger each year, adding more people each year. Where, as current count, we're just a tick under 28 million people as a nation and growing very strongly. By 2036, over the next 10 years, the latest government forecasts project us to get to 31.5 million people over the next 10 years. So adding more and more millions to that. Well, what's driving all this population growth? What's driving this change? Well, there is natural increase, which is births minus deaths, but you can see there that actually the story really is that overseas migration is driving our population growth as a nation. Over the past 10 years, around 2/3 of our population growth comes from overseas migration, and about 1/3 from births minus deaths. And really over the next 10 years, the latest forecasts project similarly around 60-40. So that is really our story as a nation, and kind of looking around the room and walking around the streets, you know that we have so many migrants to our country, and that's really driving our population growth. To the point that now, and this is national data, basically 1/3 of Australians, 32%, are born overseas. And so that just is one stat which just shows us how multicultural our society is. And when you consider the implications for language and communication, basically 1 in 4 use a non-English language at home. And now, obviously these stats differ across the nation, but this is the national average. And so when we consider how we're changing as a nation, we need to think about, okay, our workforce cohorts and our consumer cohorts are getting increasingly culturally diverse. And where is that migration coming from? Well, if we look at the last 5 years of change, and this is national data, you can see that 250,000 people from India have permanently moved to our shores in the last 5 years. Many people from the Philippines as well came in at number 2, followed by Nepal, Vietnam, and Pakistan. So you can see there very strongly that Asian and kind of South and Southeast Asian migration is really what's driving our population growth as a nation. And this, of course, is quite different to our historic migration, because we've always been a nation of migrants. But really, we've shifted from a very European-centric pattern of migration to an Asian-centric pattern. And if we look at the last 5 years from some of our historic countries of origin, you can see that actually England, Italy, Greece, Germany, and Netherlands, those numbers are negative, meaning actually we've got, in England's case, 25,000 less people in Australia today born in England than we did 5 years ago. That's what that number represents. So the migration patterns have shifted from very European-centric to very Asian-centric migration. So this is all talking about Australian demographics, noting that many of you are reaching and exporting nationally. But how about global demographic change, and what are those implications for you and for your businesses? Well, this does create opportunities. When we look at the top export markets based on national live cattle exports, 4 big ones: Indonesia, Vietnam, China, and the Philippines. I've got some numbers for those to show you here. Now, even before I show those numbers, you can kind of get a sense that, okay, not only are they from Asia, but very strongly from Southeast Asia. So Southeast Asian markets, very strong opportunities for the industry. And what else is notable is that all of these, with maybe an asterisk on China, which I'll speak to in a moment, all of these have growing populations and growing middle class segments that have greater purchasing power. So that's why it's relevant to exporters, because actually not only are these populations growing, but actually their middle classes are growing, and there's more people there with money to spend and with the technology and the means to actually look abroad and to access foreign producers and markets like Australia. So if we look at how many heads of cattle Australia exported to these nations last year, you can see Indonesia is the big one by far. There over 583,000 heads of cattle exported there. And you can see they're overlaid with the populations. So Indonesia, Vietnam, China, and Philippines. So if we look at Indonesia, which was the first one there, 287 million people. So in other words, 10 times the size of Australia in terms of population. And what's astonishing about that, of course, is that they have basically 1/4 of the land mass that we have, but 10 times the population. So again, we're one of the most sparsely populated countries in the world, as I'm sure you realize. And when we look at population growth projections over the next decade, well, Indonesia there, I just wanted to keep you hanging, so that one's not on there. But those countries are expected to grow and keep growing. And in particular, Indonesia, from memory, it was 21 million more people over the next decade. Now, the exception there is China. You can see China is actually in a state of population decline. So in the next decade, they're actually going to have 43 million less people than they do today. I mean, still 1 billion people, so no small population by any stretch. But where their population's at, they have a lot more older people because of their one-child policy in the past, and so actually they're struggling to get the people who are moving on and passing away and not being replaced by those who are being born because of their lack of younger people and young people having children. So that gives you an insight into the consumer demand over the coming years. Some of those countries, Indonesia, Vietnam, Philippines, and still China, very strong interest from some of those Southeast Asian countries. So just a quick fire, that was a couple of demographic thoughts on how we're changing as a nation and what does that mean, and even globally, what does that mean for you? Recognizing that many of you are in those employer roles or in management roles, thinking about, okay, what are some of the workforce trends we're seeing that might be relevant to you and your peers? Well, as we talk about the workforce, one of the ways that we look at people and societies at McCrindle is through the lens of generations, and just recognizing that there's many things that determine why people do what they do. There's family history and preferences, there's cultural background, there's religion, there's geography, what town you're from, different things, but also the era that you lived in, that you grew up in, the generation you're part of. We find through our research actually does have a big influence in your outlook, your preferences, what you value. A lot of that can be very similar from people who are even born in different places but lived through the same time and were shaped in the same years. So with that in mind, let's take a look at, and let's make sure we're all on the same page, to think about what are the generations we're looking at in society today and how are they defined. So we've got our builders generation. Anyone born before the end of World War II belongs to the builders generation. We've got our baby boomers, born of course in the post-World War baby boom, in the 40s, 50s and 60s. Now don't worry, I'm not going to ask for a show of hands at any point here, so you're safe. Then we've got Generation X, born or now, as you can see there, aged in their late 40s, 50s, and even entering their 60s, Gen X. Judging by the room, we're going to have a lot of Gen Xers in the room today. Now you hear a lot about the baby boomers, not as much about Gen X, but it's all right, Gen X, we see you guys, we recognize you. And you might also notice there, Gen X, where did that come from? Because we've got some descriptive labels, the builders, the boomers, and then you've got Generation X. Well, there was a guy named Douglas Copeland who popularized that term, Generation X, And really because you guys were the rebels. You're saying, we're not going to conform to the norms of our parents and grandparents. We're going to chart our own course. And you can't put us in a box. We're going to be X. So that was kind of the idea behind that label X. The irony, of course, is Generation X kicked off a new naming convention for the generations, because then we went on to have Y and Z. So the generation who couldn't be put in a box, well, they got put in a box by some people who wanted to label things. So Gen Y, also known as the millennials, children of the 80s and early 90s. So you often hear that term millennials applied to young people. Newsflash is that Gen Ys, millennials, are actually having kids. And so the generations don't wait for anyone. Gen Z, we're going to talk a bit more about, because they're the emerging generation of workers. The youngest are just finishing high school, and the oldest are already hitting their 30s. So if you've hired a recent kind of school graduate or TAFE or uni graduate in the last few years, chances are they're a Gen Z. So we're going to hear a bit more about them, what makes them unique. And then we've got Generation Alpha, because we got to the end of the alphabet, X, Y, Z, and people wondering, well, where do we go from here? Got the end. And at McCrindle, we spend a lot of time thinking and talking about the future and trying to put labels on things, because we want to be more specific than saying future people, because that's a very broad term. We want to say, well, we want to group people into categories and to talk about definitive numbers. So my colleague and our founder, Mark McCrindle, throughout this term, Generation Alpha, switching to the Greek alphabet as the first letter, and it stuck. The New York Times ran a story on it in 2015, and it seemed that the label stuck. So turns out there's no international society for naming the generations. People just throw out terms and you see kind of what sticks, and that one stuck. So Generation Alpha, recognizing this is the first generation fully born in this new millennium and the 21st century as well. And yes, we're back to the beginning of A, but something's different. And so if that naming convention follows in our 15-year cohorts, then that means Gen Beta would come next. So in the 15-year age block. So in terms of your stakeholders, your customers, your members, we're probably going to be looking more at the baby boomers, Gen X, Y, and Z. So I'm going to talk a bit more about some of them. But one way you can look at the generations is what was the breakthrough music technology that formed them? So for the builders, the breakthrough technology was the record player. That's what they kind of grew up excited about. For the baby boomers, the new breakthrough back in the day was the audio cassette. For Gen X, when the Walkman came along, that was revolutionary. For the Gen Ys, it was the iPod. You can have music in your pocket and many, many, many tracks in your pocket, not just a handful like the Walkman. Gen Z, Spotify, because it's all streaming nowadays. And for Gen Alphas, well, they don't own anything physically. They don't even have anything in their pockets. They just say, hey Siri, play me this song, or hey Alexa, play this song, and the song plays. So that's what they're used to with smart speakers now. If I can out myself as a Gen Y or millennial, this is what I was used to. That was probably my car glove box, and that was my iTunes and Spotify equivalent. Maybe some of you were the same. Times have moved on. The generations are relevant because, particularly for you in the territory, because if we look at the median age of the population, and this is our national data from our last 3 census periods, I've highlighted there in green, for the territory here, you have the youngest median age, which as of last census is age 33. So that's the average age of, if you polled people randomly on the street, the average age would be 33 years old. That's what that is saying. And you can see contrast there with the oldest state in Australia, Tasmania, almost a decade older, 42. So that's where people go to retire, it seems, Tasmania. But Northern Territory, you've got a much younger age profile. And so that age 33 puts you, if you remember the numbers in my last slide, puts you basically around the next few years. Really, it's the Gen Zs who are the dominant cohort then, if that's the average age of people in the territory today. So I thought then it'd be helpful just to take a few moments to think about Gen Z specifically. How do we understand them? There's probably some in the room as well. Hello, welcome Gen Z. But for many of you, you're trying to work them out. You're trying to employ them. You're trying to go, well, this is for our business sustainability. This is important. Maybe they're customers as well, but definitely people you're trying to train up and employ. So Google's not very helpful because if you say Gen Z are into Google, it suggests some things which are not the nicest. Gen Z are toxic, too sensitive, lazy, soft. So I don't know who's programming this stuff, but I don't think that's very fair. Well, what are some of their hopes? In some ways, not too different from probably most of us in the room. They're hoping to own their own home one day. They're hoping to have full financial freedom and independence. And they're hoping to travel and see the world. I'm sure, hopes that many of us in the room shared when we were a similar age to them. But it gives us an insight into what they value as a generation, including what they fear most. And this is quite insightful. I won't have enough money to live comfortably. I fear never being able to buy my own home. That was the second top fear. Nearly half of Gen Z say that they fear never being able to buy their own home. And then a similar proportion, fear being stuck in a job I don't enjoy or find fulfillment in. So, we've got reports and reports that I won't take you through today, but even just with that simple top 3 fears, you get a bit of a window into the psyche of Gen Z. So let's have a look. Living comfortably, so lifestyle is important to them. I think we know that. Number 2, they want to buy their own home and they're really concerned that this may not be a reality. It feels like, the Australian dream is fading away a bit, particularly in particular parts of Australia where housing is very challenging. So people who are in that battle at the moment. And the third is also quite revealing, being stuck in a job I don't enjoy or find fulfillment in. You hear from that the desire for meaningful work. I want to do something, I want to work in something that's meaningful, that feels purposeful. Which I'm sure we've all wanted to do work that's meaningful and purposeful, but it does really frame, it is one of the things that's a bit more unique to their generation, the fact that that's the language they're using from the youngest age, in a way that's often different to say what their parents and grandparents would have how they would have talked or what they would have said that they were really hoping for. Now, what do they use to educate and upskill themselves? Well, around half you can see they're saying they're using TikTok, Instagram and YouTube daily to learn new skills. So yes, these are social media platforms. We use them to, people use them, as we heard before, for brain rot, for mindless stuff. But actually Gen Z are using them to educate themselves, to learn new skills. Whether that's how to change a tire or how to cook a curry. Chances are they're not going to Google, they're not opening a book, they're actually going to TikTok and looking for how to do this. And so that's what's different about Gen Z. Words they use to describe themselves, well, they use the terms like independent, determined, and creative. What words do they use? What do they value in a leader? In a leader, in a business, in a company context, they want someone who's approachable, who's a clear communicator, and someone who has empathy. Now, this comes from a report we published a couple of years ago called The Generations Defined, and then we did a follow-up on how to cultivate healthy intergenerational teams. And this language of empathy and this desire to value that, to value empathizing, to connecting, building that personal rapport, they did stand out as actually something that was prioritized by Gen Z in a way that other generations don't. So that's something to note about Gen Z. They want to connect on that human-to-human level. They want to feel understood. They want to feel heard. And what's important to them when considering a new job? Well, naturally, this will differ based on the type of job and the context, but kind of in general terms, what they value, what they want is accessible and approachable leadership. You can see kind of that theme continuing. They want learning and development opportunities, and they want career progression opportunities. Partly that's going to be driven by life stage because they're young and they want to grow, they want to advance, they want to educate themselves. But also they're actually very driven as a generation, and despite some of the characterizations of them, there's actually a great, the data shows that actually they are, as a cohort, the self-starters, and they take initiative because a lot of the times they have to. The information's out there, it's on the web, but they have to find it themselves and they have to search, and it is there, but the initiative belongs to them. So they are moving and they're trying to move through their careers. There are some things that they're not moving through quite as much, including moving out of the family home a lot of the time. So that's given rise to the unfortunate acronym, the KIPPERS generation, which stands for Kids in Parents' Pockets Eroding Retirement Savings. So maybe you have a kipper at home, I'm sure they'd love to hear that one later tonight when you get home. You can blame me, it's all right. So why is Gen Z relevant to you? Well, if we look at workforce statistics by generation, this is the workforce today. So the baby boomers in the red there, around 12% of the workforce. So a very influential cohort, but demographically a smaller cohort. We've got our Gen X in the green, Gen Ys, already a third of the workforce, and Gen Z in the yellow, already over a quarter of the workforce. That's today. Remember, the youngest are 17, oldest are 31. So this is the power of demographics and population. Actually means that we've got more people being born every year because our population's bigger, so hence you can have numbers like this. Now that's today, but if we think about the future, because that's what we're talking about today, if we look over the next 10 years, well, the baby boomers will still be around, but phasing out of the workforce. Gen X, you can see they're 21%. You can see the yellow Gen Z, 31% of the workforce, and even Gen Alpha, who are still in school in 10 years' time, already beat 19% of the workforce. Again, if you want to fact check that, it comes back to the power of demographics and population growth. So that will explain why half of the workforce in 10 years' time will be Gen Z or younger. So how do you talk to Gen Z? Well, this is a conversation that I overheard between two Gen Z colleagues of mine. Maybe you're familiar with some of this language, or maybe you can use this as an educational exercise. So let's see what they said. Here we go. Two girls talking to each other. Bae, my new work gig is legit. The hours are savage. YOLO. Can we decipher what's being said here between these two Gen Zs? The reply comes back. Yas queen, slay girl, goat, fire emoji. Okay, some of you are really scratching your heads, I can see. Let's try to decipher this line by line. So bae, like my bestie, my new work gig, my new job, okay? It's legit, it's good, it's great, I love it. The hours are savage, okay, I'm working hard. YOLO, which of course stands for you only live once. So, I'm working hard, but what the heck, gotta do it, right? And then the reply from her very affirming friend, yes, queen, so you're the queen, you're the top of your field, you got this, girl. Slay girl, similar concept, kill it, you're killing it. Goat. Now, if a young person calls you the goat, it's actually a good thing. The greatest of all time is the acronym. You might have heard this applied to sports people. So you're the goat, that's usually a compliment. And then fire emoji, again, you're killing it, you're slaying it. We could, of course, simplify all this to say, I like my job, great. But where's the fun in that? So there's some Gen Z lingo for you. I've got some other Gen Alpha lingo, but I thought that might be a bridge too far for today, so we'll just stop with Gen Z. Now, it also means that with generations, sometimes there's a bit of a communication divide with the language, but also just with technology. So this was a conversation overheard in a different office. Could you fax over a copy, came the request. The reply came back, no, I can't fax because of where I live. So you're probably thinking, okay, remote community or far north Queensland, not sure. Where do you live? Well, the reply came back a bit cheekily, 21st century. So again, we need to think through what are the technologies we're using and expecting others to use, and are they actually going to be familiar with those? Will they even have one of those things in their workplace? Maybe in the fax machine's case, a lot less so these days, I'd say, even polling the room if we did that. So Gen Z are relevant because actually increasingly they're going to be your workforce over the coming years, and certainly for business continuity, an important demographic to understand and engage with. But the other thing to note is actually that as a nation, and this will be reflecting our consumer trends too that I'll come to in a moment, the workforce participation, this data from the ABS, shows that really since 1980, the top line there, the proportion of Australians who are engaged in the workforce has remained pretty steady. It's around 2/3. It's increased slightly, but not that much. The bigger line that's changed is the bottom line, which you can see more clearly on the right-hand side. That's the percentage of people aged 65 plus who are actively engaged in the workforce. And that's basically doubled in the last 20 years. So yes, Gen Z are a key cohort, but actually, as people, because of different reasons and technology, are often able to work longer, or because of cost of living challenges and affordability, need to work longer, our workforces are increasingly going to be stretched at both ends. So yes, there's an important cohort in the younger demographics to engage with, but also there's going to be, on law of averages, increasingly people working later in life who are going to be part of the workforce too. And so we work with a lot of leaders going, well, how do you help create a cohesive workforce when you're working across different generations and with all the different language and different barriers that might come with that. So if that's particularly relevant to you, we've got a link to some resources that we recently published last year around the generational worker profiles, so some of what I've shared just then, snapshot across generations, what do they have in common, what's distinctive about them in a workplace setting. You're welcome to access that free resource. I'll also send it through later as well. So that was a few stats on workforce. Finish with some reflections on changing consumer context. Again, recognizing there's people from different types of connection points to the industry here, but what are some kind of broader consumer trends that we're noticing, which I think would be broadly applicable to everyone in this room? The first continues a theme that I was just sharing in terms of the workforce, that at a consumer level, we're seeing expanding consumer life cycles. In other words, the consumer age range is expanding older and younger at the same time. Now, how is that possible? Let me show you a couple of stats. This is looking at national data. This is our distribution of income and wealth by generation. So we've got an infographic that kind of lays this out, which you can access on our website. You can see there highlighted the older baby boomers, so those 65 to 74. The top blue circle, they comprise 9% of the national population. But then the bigger blue circle, they hold 26% of the national wealth. So roughly 10% of the nation's population, but a quarter of the national wealth. Even though in terms of working and income, average income of 75 grand a year, so on less than it used to be, because many of them are cycling down kind of their working lives. So one of the big trends that we're noticing is, and I'm sure you've heard it talked about in the media and other places, is that people are living longer, and actually as a cohort, again, this is not going to be true for everyone, but as a cohort generally, they are a cohort with larger wealth available, and there's many reasons for that. One being the way house prices have trended over the decades. But actually they've got wealth and they're not afraid to spend it. And so we're seeing that. So actually you're going to have more people who are spending later in life actively, and so they're increasingly presenting a consumer cohort that's relevant, that would not have been as relevant in the past. And that's a bit more vivid when you contrast, say, to Gen X in the middle there, who comprise 12% of our national population, so more than the boomers there, but only hold 17% of the national wealth, despite the fact that they're in their peak earning years. So on average, Gen X 158 grand a year as a national average taking home. So you can see the contrast between the 9 and 26% and then the 12 and 17 in terms of the concentration of wealth. So people are living longer and spending later. And they're not just spending on themselves. So I want to give credit to the baby boomers here. We found through one of our national studies last year that over half of families with dependent children, so families with young kids at home, say that actually their grandparents often buy day-to-day items for their household or their children. So we've got this older cohort who are spending on themselves, but also spending for their kids and their grandkids increasingly, to help out what they see as some of the challenges for the younger generations. And I said this goes both ways. So we also found in the same study that 77% of parents with dependent children say their children strongly influence what they buy for their household. 3/4. 3/4 of mums and dads are saying, actually, my child influences what I buy in my household. And that's new. That's not been the case historically, because children have had agency over certain things, but not over other things. But we live in a time when, because of parenting styles changing and because of all these other reasons, children, even though they don't have cash to spend physically themselves, they're influencing household spending decisions that are made, even before they reach those ages where they can have money of their own. So that's what we mean when we say, actually, the age of consumers is getting older because we've got more older people spending for longer, but also it's getting younger because you're having younger people influencing household spending. So that's worth keeping in mind as you develop your products and develop your marketing to families. Increasingly, the children are having a say in what the families buy for their household, whether it relates to food or whether it relates to other products for the family home. So that was the first one, the consumer age range stretching in both directions. The other one, which is again a bit paradoxical, is that in this hyper-globalized world, people are really engaging locally and prioritizing that. Companies today are expected to have the systems, the reach, and the convenience of a global organization, but people also want them to have the authenticity and the relatability of a local supplier, a local business. Because we know that online marketplaces have been growing, but also the support for local businesses has been too. So these two seemingly opposing trends have been happening at the same time. Which, as we talk to businesses, it leaves a lot of people in a dilemma. Okay, so do I focus on the growing overseas market opportunities, or do I prioritize the local ones? That's a challenge that many leaders are thinking through. So in a big national study we conducted last year, and I'll put up a link to some free resources for that later for those interested, but we asked, this was everyday Australians, we polled people, we asked them, why do you choose to purchase from a local business? So we asked a range of questions about what people see drives them to purchase from an overseas supplier. But this question was, well, when you purchase from a local supplier, why? Like, what drives you to purchase from a local business? So this gives you a sense of people's priorities. The number one driver is to support the local economy or local community. When people said, I buy local, that's usually the number one reason for them doing so. Number two, their ability to see or try a product in person. And naturally for different industries and contexts, this will mean different things or not be very possible. But that sense of, if it's local, I can see it, it feels more tangible. If I'm buying overseas, I never get to sight it personally, I have a sense of distrust. I'm wondering, is it what it claims to be? People saying with local, they get better customer service or personalized experience. People value that. Again, trust. People say they trust local providers more. They trust that it's what it says it does on the tin. The company is who they say they are. And then the speed of access. So different language might apply to different industries, but people saying actually that speed of access, particularly today when we've got global wars and conflicts, people going, well, if I buy something online, I'm questioning, is it going to get to me when it says it will? Will it get to me at all? So I think in this current era, that's really a factor for people in their consideration. And also for wholesalers and suppliers too. I'm sure you find that in business-to-business type settings. Thanks, Connor. In business-to-business type settings too, this is a consideration, particularly when we're in the middle of global wars, that actually this question of will it actually get to me, supply chain risk, that's increasingly a factor. While all the generations are equally likely to purchase from a local retailer, their reasons for doing so vary. So I thought that would just be helpful to pop up a couple of points on that. So those who said that they want to support the local economy, much more strong driver for our older generations, Gen X and baby boomers, being motivated by that. Able to see or try the product in person, again, much more of a factor for the Gen X and baby boomers. Easier returns or exchanges was pretty similar across the board. Better customer service or more personalized service, you can see there for the baby boomers that was more important to them, and more of a driver to purchase locally. That sense of being able to connect with the person, probably to have a yarn as well, have a chat, more for the baby boomers, influential to them. What about for Gen Z? What was more influential to them? Well, actually, them believing that the company they purchased from had ethical labor practices and fair wages. They were twice as likely as Gen X, for example, to say that was something that would drive them to purchase from an Aussie supplier, because they trust that actually there'd be better business practices employed here, and that matters to them. And access to locally made, unique or artisan products was a bigger driving force for Gen Z to buy locally. Now that language we're seeing quite a lot for Gen Z. Artisan, bespoke, so that in a world of mass production, where you can buy things on the cheap from Temu or wherever online. Gen Z, it seems, in particular, and I think all of us to a degree, but the data definitely shows Gen Z are saying, well, actually, I want to have something that feels unique, that feels artisan. There's actually been a return to people valuing craftsmanship. And so if you can highlight this, if this is a part of your business story, your company story, that's going to have appeal to Gen Z, because actually they say, I want to have something that feels like it's customized, it's made with love and care, not just mass produced in a factory, is what they're saying. So that's a factor to keep in mind. And finally, as a consumer trend, we're seeing what we can kind of group and call values-driven decisions. So what motivates people to buy one thing over the other? Well, of course, price does, but it's not the only thing. And if the last few years have taught us anything, it's actually that there's a range of factors, not necessarily as this chart shows, all equal, it's just an illustration, but things like environmental impact, wanting to support local business or a small business, sustainability, convenience. There's a whole range of factors other than price that motivates people, while price still does motivate people as well, and I'll speak to that in a moment. This is quite noticeable when we look at across the generations, how does this play out? In the same national consumer study, we asked people their agreement or disagreement with this statement. I frequently use my purchasing decisions to communicate what I value in life. Now, this is what we're getting at with this whole values purchasing concept is, in the past, it was much more, well, just does it do what it says on the tin? Because if you do that, then great, I'll buy it from you. And that's still the case for many people, that's what they want. But increasingly, so people are asking other questions about, well, not just does it do what it says it would do on the tin, that's kind of the bottom, that's the baseline expectation. But if I buy from this company, do I want to be associated with this company? Do I want to be associated with this brand? How does that reflect on me? These are questions that people are asking now, which were not questions that people were contemplating maybe 10 or 20 years ago. And it's definitely being driven by the younger generations. You can see there, Gen Z and Gen Y, much more likely to say that they use their purchasing decisions to communicate what they value in life. So again, a paradigm shift there, perhaps for many of us in the room and how we might approach a purchasing decision. So we could say that customers have their values, but they're also seeking value. They want value at the end of the day, particularly in a cost of living challenging time like we're in now. And yes, people acknowledge that, because over 3/4 of Australians say they're extremely or very concerned about the rising cost of living. Or in other words, they might feel a bit like Kermit the Frog here. Being an adult is a bit out of my price range right now. Some people just feel that way. It's just hard to adult today. It costs a lot. But that's the 77%, but a similar proportion, 69%, agree that even when tightening spending, in some areas, they choose to splurge on little luxuries that make them feel good. So what this shows is that even during times of economic challenge and strain, consumption decisions are intertwined with identity. People are saying, I still want to buy things that make me feel good inside, that give me a good feeling, even when I'm cutting back overall. And so consumers are kind of stuck between valuing affordability on the one hand, due to their circumstances, but also they want to splurge on what makes them feel good or what makes them look good to others. It dovetails into this concept of people valuing life as an experience. So you can see there, Gen Y is 80%, Gen Z is 73%, but really across generations there's a broad agreement with the statement that splurging on little luxuries is important to me. And so this is the language we're hearing, people saying, actually, life is an experience and I want to enjoy it as we go. I don't just want to kind of slave away till retirement and then enjoy myself then. I want to enjoy myself as I go through life too. So hence, spending even in times of economic strain. We could sum that up by saying people don't just want a product, they do want a product, but they want an experience too. And that will have different applications for different industries, but in terms of how you market and communicate what you're offering, that's worth keeping in mind, that's what people are wanting today. So if those kind of consumer trends and stats were of interest to you, that's a link to a free summary of the report I mentioned. The report we titled Consumer Paradoxes, the Megatrends Shaping the Consumer Landscape. It's available on our website for people to look at as well, for those who are interested later. We've covered a lot of ground there. You've been a very engaged audience. We've talked through some demographic trends, some workforce trends, and some consumer trends to think about. Hopefully spark some discussions over lunch. So let me just use the final couple of moments to close and to sum things up, because we've covered a lot of ground there. So let's just recap. In summary, we've said that changing demographics present new opportunities as well as new challenges. But there's new opportunities and challenges there that come from demographic change. And remember, that applies both in Australia and also beyond. So many of you interested in overseas markets as well. So that's the demographics. That generational change is impacting the workforce. So generational change is impacting the workforce, and as Gen Z rises through the ranks. So again, we talked a bit about Gen Z as workers. We had some laughs about the language they use, but remember that according to the median age, they're going to be the dominant cohort of workers over the next few years. And so really, for business continuity, a cohort to be keeping in mind how you engage with them proactively. We learned that paradoxically, our customers are getting older and younger at the same time, as people's spending extends in life, but also as younger people have more influence on their household spending decisions too. So we've got to keep that in mind. We learned that global markets are important, but actually that people are prioritising local as well. And what are some of the factors people are doing that might be relevant for you as a particularly Australian. We do have Australia has a very strong brand when it comes to so many goods and services, but I think particularly anything in the food industry, and certainly in the beef industry, you've got a very strong kind of Australian brand, so that's something to lean into. And now you know some of the factors that people would prioritise in buying from a local supplier. And then people care about values, as in they have a range of values that they've got in mind when they're purchasing, but also they still care about value, getting value, the dollar and the bottom line. So as I come to a close, let me leave you with this final thought that my colleague Mark often reminds us. The strength of an organisation comes from its stories and traditions, but its future rests in its relevance and innovation. Thanks very much for your time today.
Please accept this little token of our appreciation. And I know we're just about done for time, but it occurred to me when you were talking about the social media section, this is just hypothetical, right? I'm a very active social media poster. I post some forthright, some would say provocative things on my social media platforms without ever considering that down the track I might be offered a significant public position. How might one best navigate the dilemma of being a front foot player while protecting one's future opportunities? Asking for a friend.
Love the question. And look, I'll be up front. Obviously, I'm not a PR guru, but we have two things that are happening. One, if I may put that there for a second. One is that in the media, cancel culture is such a strong kind of trend, and so there's just a strong desire to just tear down anyone who said anything remotely offensive at some point in their life, no matter how young or old. And so, but we're also seeing, and I think there's a bit more pushback on this even more recently, that people are going, well, there is recognition that people are human, and so at the same time as cancel culture is a thing, there's also a growing recognition that people are saying, actually, that's just them being them and being really human and authentic. So actually, that makes them appealing to me. They're not a robot. But which voice is louder? At the moment, it's still the cancel culture kind of voices. But it seems to be the pendulum swinging a bit. Naturally, it would depend on the content of what's shared, and some things can be brushed off a bit more from full enthusiasm or different things. So I'm not sure anyone was looking for PR advice from me, but I think that's probably our big take, is that while yes, there's a very strong kind of cancel culture, particularly in certain parts of the media, people on the street, there's a lot more acceptance of, well, actually that shows that you're human like the rest of us, and there's an appeal to that. Of course, it depends on exactly what was said or done.
Thanks so much, Grant. I'll let Grace Tame know.
Thank you.
Please take that.
Thank you.